My topic today is Yom Yerushalayim and the saying of the Hallel. Yom Yerushalayim, of course, is this Friday. It's Thursday night Friday. However, every year when it's right before Shabbat, the Rabbanut brings it one day before. That's why it'll be Wednesday night, Thursday. By the way, the same thing is done when Yom Haatzmaut. The original Yom Haatzmaut fell out on a Friday. So actually, it happens quite often that Yom Haatzmaut is Thursday night, Friday, but the Rabbanut, because of their worried about Chilul Shabbat and desecrating the Sabbath, they always request that it go a day before in such a scenario. So I'd like to talk about Yom Yerushalayim. It's really the same question of Yom Haatzmaut, Israel Independence Day and Hallel, and Yom Yerushalayim and Hallel. Within the religious community, I would say since 1948, there's been discussions about the issue of saying Hallel on Yom Haatzmaut. Probably the first Yom Haatzmaut in 1948, there was probably no discussion. But it always happens afterwards. When the excitement is over, then people start thinking, do we do the right thing? Do we not do the right thing? Even among those who say Hallel Yom Haatzmaut, in the early years, Hallel was said both at night and day with a blessing. Most people today say it just during the day with a blessing and not at night. So first of all, what I'd like to do is discuss the halakha a little bit about this. There's a wonderful book that came out years ago by Nachum Rackover called Yom Haatzmaut v'Yom Yerushalayim b'Halakha, which is a halakhic discussion of the issues relating to Yom Haatzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, which of course is very important to understand that these are not just nationalist desires, but actually halakhic ramifications for acting such, and I would even go in further into saying halakhic duties of acting and obligations of acting in such a way. I'm going to bring just a few sources, and then I want to talk about the sources, and that'll be it. So the first one is from the Talmud in the tractate of Erchin. This is Yud Amud Beit, page 10b. And the Talmud discusses the days in which we say Hallel. And the Talmud says, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak, Shmona Asar Yamim Shayachid Gomer Be'em Hallel. There are 18 days on the calendar where we finish the Hallel. The difference between the full Hallel, or what's called finishing the Hallel, and the half Hallel is actually only two psalms from the Psalms of David, from the Tehillim. That's the difference. The full one has those two psalms, the half one, which means the non-full one, does not. Everyone makes a blessing on a full Hallel, Ashkenazim and Sfardim. Ashkenazim make a blessing even on a half Hallel, which is recited on Rosh Chodesh, and whereas Sfardim don't make a blessing on a half Hallel. So here we're talking about 18 days in the year, which is a full Hallel. So, Shmona Asar Yamim She'achid Gomer Be'em Hallel, 18 days that a person finishes the Hallel, Shmona Yamei Achag, the 8 days of the holiday, which means Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, the 8 days of Chanukah, the first day of Passover, whereas the rest days of Pesach, it's a half Hallel, and of course, and Shavuot. And outside of Israel, where they have a second day of Yom Tov, comes out to 21 days. So, then the Talmud says on the next page on Amud Beit, as I said on 10b, when it's talking about the various days, the Talmud says, Vaha Chanukah, says, what is the definition of days that are supposed to say Hallel? It says, Hashir lechem kalil yitkadesh chag, laila mekudash lechag taun shira. The Talmud says that a day which is considered a holy day by the Torah, a chag, it needs shira, it needs song. Song is referring to the Hallel. So all these days which are considered chag, which are considered moadim or religious holidays according to the Torah, these are the days where we say full Hallel, which is called shira. But if it's not, then it doesn't have a shira. So then the Talmud says, "V'ha Chanukah do lo hachi v'lo hachi." What about Chanukah? It is not a biblical holiday in any sense. So why do we say Hallel on Chanukah? So the Talmud says, Mishum Nisa, because there was on Chanukah there was a nes, there was a miracle. And just before you think the miracle was about the oil flask, you should understand the miracle means that we were saved from destruction in the war against the Seleucid kingdom. And I'll show you the proof right now. Because then the Talmud says, what about Purim? There was also a miracle on Purim. And again, what was the miracle on Purim? The miracle was that Haman didn't destroy us. So we should also say Hallel. The Talmud says in the name of Yitzchak, you don't say Shira, you don't say Hallel in a miracle that happened outside the land of Israel. So we have here then a concept that there are 18 days where full Hallel is said, and including Chanukah. And the Talmud says, why Chanukah? It's not one of these holidays, but the Talmud says because there was a nes, there was a miracle. So we then have our first definition that Hallels can be introduced, even if it's not a biblical holiday, if a miracle happened. Now we know that in our prayer books, in our Sidurim, when we talk about Chanukah and Purim, in the Shemona Esrei, we say, Al Hanisim Vala Purkan, which means on the miracles and on the salvations. And when you read what it says about Chanukah, you can see it doesn't actually talk about the oil flask. It only says, Rabim biad me'atim, Rishayim biad tzadikim, that the few were able to succeed over the many. And that was really the miracle of Chanukah. And Purim also we say Al Hanisim, and the miracle of Purim was also being saved from the decimation, or the planned decimation of Haman. Now this concept we find also in other places in the Talmud. The Talmud says in Psachim 117a, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. Shmuel is the first generation of Amoraim in Babylonia. Shir Sheba Torah Moshe Yisrael Amaruhu. The song in the Torah, which means a song on the sea, Shirat Hayam, in the book of Exodus. So Moses and the Jewish people said it when they went through the Red Sea. V'halel zeh mi amaro. So that was the song of the sea. What about the Hallel? We say Hallel on Passover. Who said Hallel? So the Talmud says, Nevi'im shebenehem tiknu lem liYisrael sheomrim otan al kol perek veperek v'kol tzara v'tzara. The prophets among them, and of course they had many prophets among them, starting from Moses and Miriam, and of course after too. The prophets among them instituted that the Jewish people, that the Israelites say the Hallel, al kol perek veperek, which is an interesting thing to say. What does it mean, al kol perek veperek? Here he translates it, for each and every season, v'al kol tzara v'tzara, and for every trouble that befall them. L'shenegalim omrim oto ala geulatan. So if God saves us from persecution, from trouble, we have to say the Hallel. So here already in Psachim it says that when the prophets instituted the Hallel, they did not just institute it for the biblical salvations and holidays, but any future times of peril and distress and persecution, when the Jews are saved as a people from this, then they must say Hallel. This is what the Talmud says in Psachim Kuf Yud Zayin. As Rashi says, Rashi gives an example, and he says, what does it mean on every persecution? Anytime, chas v'shalom, if there is a persecution, heaven forbid, and God saves us from that, we have to say on our redemption, Hallel, just like Chanukah. Why does Rashi say specifically Chanukah? Because Chanukah happened after the biblical period. And Chanukah is the best example then of saying a full Hallel on a holiday where we're saying Hallel because God saved us in our battle against the Seleucid army, the Yavanim, the Greeks. This idea we find again in the Talmud in Megillah. Megillah 14a, Yud Daled Aleph. Again, the Talmud brings a baraita. A baraita is a Tanaic statement, like a Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught. 48 Nevi'im v'sheva Neviot nitnabu lehem Yisrael. There were 48 male prophets and 7 women prophets that prophesied in Israel. By the way, the Talmud also in Megillah says that even though in the Torah we find 48 male prophets and 7 women prophets, that doesn't mean that that's the amount of actual prophets in the Jewish people. According to the Talmud, if you take the whole period of prophecy, even from the point, let's say from Moses on, because before Moses there was Abraham, but if you take from Moses on until the end of prophecy, the time of Malachi, at the beginning of the Second Temple, the Talmud says there were as many prophets within the Jewish people, kiflaim ki yotzei Mitzrayim, like twice the number of people who left Egypt. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us exactly how many left Egypt, but it tells us how many males between the ages of 20 and 60 left Egypt, because it counts them as the soldiers. And there were over 600,000. So even if we take that minimalistic number, the 600,000, and we double it, it's 1.2 million. So there were at least 1.2 million real prophets, according to the Talmud. So then where are they? Where are all their books? So the Talmud says in Megillah, not all of them, their prophecies were written. Nevuah shenitztarcha ledorot nichteva, a prophecy which was needed for later generations was written down. Lo nitztarcha ledorot lo nichteva. If it was not needed for later generations, it wasn't written down. Now what is a prophecy that's not needed for later generations? Personal prophecy. Remember, when a prophet speaks to God, if you had the chance to speak to God, think for yourself, what would be the first question you would ask? Who's going to form the government? I don't think so. What's going to happen in the political arena? Probably not. When the stock market's going to go up? I don't think so. The first question you would ask is, what am I doing here? What is the meaning of my life? Give me some direction. Explain to me the paradox of the human condition where we're born and then we die after we finally try to put our lives together. These are the ultimate questions of life, which would probably be the first questions you would ask God, not the other ones. So when God talks to a prophet and reveals them something about their lives, this is the first thing the prophet wants to know. Some prophets also were leaders, and God sent them to nations, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., and Micah, but some prophets, they just prophesied, and God told them what they wanted to know in order to help with their own lives. It says in the book of Kings that there was a fellow by the name of Vadia, who during the decrees of Jezebel and Achav, he hid 180 prophets of God in a cave. We don't even know their names, but they were out there somewhere. So getting back to this text, there were 48 prophets and 7 women prophets, and they never subtracted or added to anything written in the Torah. The very fact that they received prophecy from God, they did not see this as a challenge to the prophecy of Moses, which is the Torah. The only exception was the Megillah. What does it mean, the Megillah? That they said we have to read the Megillah of Esther. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha and my Darush, how did they know that we had to read the Megillah of Esther on Purim? We don't read a Megillah on Chanukah. How do these prophets know that? So Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, who is, by the way, the son of Rabbi Akiba, which is a very important point, I'll get back to that, said, Uma me'avdut lecherut amrei shira mimita lechaim lo kol sheken. How did these prophets, did they receive it directly in prophecy, or did they understand it logically? Yeshua ben Korcha, who's actually not a prophet but a scholar, he says, maybe they figured out logically. Because let's think for a second. Hallel, we say at Passover. Why do we say Hallel at Passover? Said if we went from slavery to freedom, that's why we say Hallel at Passover, right? We were slaves to power, we went to freedom. So Yeshua ben Korcha says, look, if from slavery to freedom, a person says Shira, sings a song, which means Hallel, so if we had gone from certain death to life, isn't it an a fortiori? For sure, we should say Hallel. So this is what the prophets said to themselves. They said if Pesach, where we go from servitude to freedom, we're saying Hallel, then the Purim story, where Haman wanted to decimate all the Jews, and we went from certain death to life, for sure we should say the Hallel. So then the Talmud, of course, asks, so why don't we say Hallel on Purim? And the Talmud answers here the same thing it answers in other places. Because you don't say Hallel on a miracle that happened outside of Israel, only in Israel. So Chanukah took place in Israel, the salvation of the Jewish people, we say Hallel. Purim, we read the Megillah. It's instead of Hallel. That's what the Talmud says in another place. So, we've now seen from three sources that yes, there is a concept of Hallel linked to biblical holidays, but we also see that Hallel was a takana, was an enactment of the prophets. Al kol tzara shelo tavo, on any time there is duress, suffering, and danger for the Jewish people, and God saves us, Hallel becomes an obligation. And as Rashi brings the example of Chanukah, the reason why we say Hallel on Chanukah, despite the fact that Chanukah is not a biblical holiday, is because we went from certain death to life. And Purim is in the same category, but since Purim, the salvation happened outside of Israel, so we read the Megillah instead of saying Hallel, because Hallel is only recited on a salvation to the Jewish people in the land of Israel. The Talmud and Megillah actually says it in two different ways. When the Talmud says, why don't we say Hallel on Purim? So the first answer that Talmud gives, like where we just read now in 14, Megillah 14, is that the Megillah is instead of reading the Megillah is instead of saying Hallel. But in another place the Talmud says, actually, Akati Avdei Achashverosh Anan. We are still serving Achashverosh. We're still slaves. We're still in servitude in the Purim story to Achashverosh, to the king Achashverosh. So it's not a full salvation. There's not real freedom. There's no real Jewish sovereignty. So you cannot call that full freedom because you never know what the next day is going to bring. So until now we've established that Hallel, halakhically, is introduced every time there is a major salvation of the Jewish people. And halachically it's supposed to be done when there is a major salvation to the Jewish people in the land of Israel. If it happens outside the land of Israel, so we had this enactment of reading the Megillah, but even Hallel was not done on Purim, even though there were prophets around which could have enacted it, like Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, who were still around even after the Purim story, according to the Talmud. So, there seems to be a halakhic obligation But what is the character of this obligation? What is the meaning of this obligation? It's an obligation of thanksgiving. Okay, it's nice to say thank you. And if I didn't say thank you, is it so terrible? The answer is yes. So some people say, they say, okay, I'm not saying Yom Haatzmaut is not an important day, what happened to the Jewish people, and Yom Yerushalayim, when we reunited Jerusalem, is not an important day, but hey, we're talking about halakha here, and making blessings. You can't just make a blessing on the Hallel just like that, because of something happened to the Jewish people. No? Then what did we just read in the Talmud? That's exactly what it says. If you take Judaism seriously, then you have to understand what the sources are saying. It's true. The last time it happened was in Hanukkah. So, when was the last time we had a Jewish sovereignty? During the 2,000 years of the exile in the land of Israel. That's why it took so long for it to happen again. So somebody will come along and say, okay, but you know what? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You're not sure. But making a decision not to say is also a decision. It means you're deciding not to be grateful. And let me show you a source that not being grateful is also a problem. This one comes from the Talmud in Sanhedrin 94a. The Talmud here, and remember, the word shira is the term that the Talmud always refers to when it says Hallel. The Talmud says in Sanhedrin, Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu lasod Chizkiyahu Mashiach v'Sancheriv Gog uMagog. At the end of the second temple period, at the end of the first temple period, God had compassion on the Jewish people. There was a good king. His name was Hezekiah. He was one of the last kings of Judah. But the Jewish people thrived under him, and he brought back faith and credibility and Jewish observance and integrity. And God wanted to make Hezekiah Mashiach. I guess I have to explain what the word Mashiach means. I'll try to do this very quickly because this is a short talk. To make Hezekiah Mashiach means, in the Bible, Mashiach, of course, means being anointed. The ones who are anointed are the kings. Every king is anointed. Even the kings of Judea and the kings of Israel were anointed. Kings of Judea were anointed with a shofar by the prophets. So the anointed one, of course, is the king. As it says in Lamentations, Mashiach Hashem nilkad b'shchitotam, the anointed one of God fell because of our iniquities. And the anointed of God meaning the king. Now Hezekiah was a king from Judea. He was a legitimate king, and he was anointed. So when the Talmud says God wanted to make him Mashiach, it means that special anointed king who's also going to create that Jewish renaissance in the land of Israel, reunite our brethren in the north and the part south of Israel under the one God again. In other words, God thought that Hezekiah had the skill and the ability to bring a renaissance of Jewish life just like it happened under David and Solomon. And since, I guess this only happens once, that God steps in, that's why if it doesn't happen earlier, it happens later. And he wanted that Sancheriv, the king of Syria, be that final battle of Gog and Magog. Because why not? We have a righteous king. Why wait till later? Why not do it right now? Save the Jewish people from the diaspora, from a galut, from an exile. The Talmud says, Amram midat adin lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. but which means the stern judgment. It's almost like personifying stern judgment. Midat hadin, this concept of midat hadin, which means, let's see the way he translates it here. Midat hadin means the attribute of stern judgment. Here he says the attribute of justice, exclaimed before the Holy One, and said, Master of the universe, if David, king of Israel, who said all these songs before you in the Psalms and all these praises, you did not make him the final Messiah, Hezekiah, who you did all these miracles for because he saved Jerusalem when Sancheriv captured the northern kingdom and then came to Jerusalem and put a siege around it. So it says in the book of Kings 2 that God created this thunderous noise, and the Assyrians thought that it was the Egyptian army that were coming to act as allies for the Jews against them, and they all ran away. So here you did all these miracles for Hezekiah, V'lo amar shira, but he did not sing before you. He didn't say Hallel. He didn't praise you. He didn't thank you. Taseh Mashiach, and you're going to make him Messiah? He doesn't deserve it. He was ungrateful. Lechach nistatem. And God didn't have an answer. And then the land of Israel called out and said, Master of the universe, let me sing the song instead of Hezekiah. I'm willing to do it. Let's just do this. Let's get it over with. Because he's a righteous man, and make him the Messiah. And the land of Israel started singing, as it says in the verse, Miknaf ha'aretz mirot shamanu tzvi latzadik. So, as the verse says, from the edge of the earth we have heard songs, do the wish of the righteous, which is taken from Isaiah 24. But then one of the ministering angels said, Master of the universe, can you do this? And the answer was, it is a secret. It is a secret. And then later on, the Talmud says again, in the name of Rabbi Papayos, Genaihu lechizkiah. It is a negative stain. He translates it here. It's a discredit of Chizkiah and his subjects. They did not recite these praises of God until the land did. God wanted to make Hezekiah the Messiah. He couldn't, because Hezekiah did not sing Hallel when God saved Jerusalem. So he didn't deserve it. God saved us twice. 1948, in the battle for independence. 1967, in the battle for Jerusalem. And the truth is other times too. 1973. My humble opinion, there's good reason to think the same there, but I'm not going to push my opinion on other people's turf at this moment. But definitely when the state was created, when we had our backs towards the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the feeling among the leadership, especially Ben Gurion, was either state or nothing. And when Ben Gurion turned to the head of Israeli intelligence at the time, which was Yigal Allon, said, Yigal, what are the chances of this fledgling Jewish state with our little army winning in a battle against 7 Arab armies? And Allon said, David, not more than 50-50. And Ben Gurion, who understood the magnitude of the Shoah that they were just after, said, when in the last 2,000 years has the Jewish people had such good odds to win back the land of Israel? And against the maybe at the time better judgment of Harry Truman, he went ahead, and even against the judgment of a lot of his own ministers, he went ahead and declared the state. And in 1967 too, and it was, by the way, very dangerous. It was a real risk, 1948. It could have been a decimation of the Jewish people again, of the land of Israel. So this salvation warranted a Hallel according to all the sources I just read you. And Yom Yerushalayim. In 1967, when the Egyptians blocked the Straits of Tiran, which in the agreement of 1956 was considered an act of war, it was just a matter of time until the war would start. So Israel decided to attack first and was able to destroy the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the land, which gave us the cutting edge in that battle. And it was probably the greatest victory of the state of Israel's history. And Jerusalem became the symbol of this victory, which could have gone the other way. So definitely Hallel was warranted in such a case too. And just like in the time of Hezekiah, if you do not say the Hallel, if you do not take your obligation seriously to thank God for what happens, this is a discredit. We lose merit for this. It must be done. On the individual level, I know that there's certain people who I'm not going to blame, but think certain religious Jews who say, well, I don't know, my rabbi said that maybe I shouldn't say Hallel with a blessing. So, as some people say, you know what, your rabbi says not to say a blessing, but say it without a blessing. It's just verses in Tehillim, you can't read that. And then God will know your heart. But if you say nothing, it's a discredit, as the Talmud says in Sanhedrin about Hezekiah. So here, when we are on the eve of Yom Yerushalayim, and when we recite Hallel during the day of Yom Yerushalayim, like we do on Yom Haatzmaut, we should be proud of the fact that we're given direction and that we know when to say thanks and when to thank for the guidance that has brought us from the beginning until this day. And maybe during these difficult times when the state of Israel has become almost, hopefully we'll get there, an island of quietude in a world which is suffering heavily from viruses and other things, we also have to give thanks that God is sparing us, because this giving thanks and realizing that God does step in when it comes to the collective of the Jewish people is part of our belief and part of our obligation. Yom Yerushalayim Sameach. I wish everybody a happy Yom Yerushalayim. Shalom, shalom.